Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the St. Louis Java Users Group October 2021 edition. For those who don't know, the St. Louis Java Users Group is an informal group. Attendance is free. We don't maintain a formal membership list. Normally, we meet on the second Thursday of every month except for December when there is no meeting. There's just too many things going on over the holidays for us to be able to schedule a meeting then. When we meet in person, you can join us for food and social at 6 p.m. and the presentation starts at 6:30. Our normal meeting location when we meet in person is in the Object Computing Incorporated Training Room at 12,140 Woodcrest Executive Drive. That's Suite 310 in St. Louis, Missouri. That's given to us by our sponsor, Object Computing, which has been with us from the beginning. Let me introduce the rest of the members of the steering committee for the St. Louis Java Users Group. So from left to right, we have Ted Doyle, Todd Zimmerman, Bruce Allspaw, that's me in the middle, Wei-Chi Gao, and Kathy Zwang. You can reach all of us on the steering committee if you just send an email to that address there at the bottom of the slide. That's javasigsc@ociweb.com. The St. Louis Java Users Group would not be possible without the support of our sponsors. So we've got their logos up here. So I'd like to thank Object Computing Incorporated. They've been with us since, oh gosh, I want to say something like 1997. They are our founding sponsor here, and they've been supplying the room when we meet in person, and web hosting and food and all kinds of things when we need them to fill in. They've always been able to save us. JFrog has also been quite helpful. They have been covering the Zoom subscription, which allows us to bring this meeting to you. And also they have covered the fees for the meetup group. Now it's free for you to be able to RSVP and come to the meeting, but it does cost the group some funds to be able to have a meetup page on the meetup site. And they cover that fee for us to keep it free. And on occasion, they will show up and they will add some prizes to the raffle as well. Signature Consultants and Adaptive Solutions Group are headhunters. When we meet in person, they will often sponsor the food for the meetings, but we haven't figured out a way to send the pizza over the internet. And until we do, we just kind of put that on hold. But if you're looking for a Java position, or if you're trying to hire someone, look them up on the web and tell them that you found out about them through the St. Louis Java Users Group, because they will quite often have positions that they need to fill, and there's opportunities there. So say hello to them. At the end of the meeting, we will be raffling 2 Jetbrains licenses. So they are one of our sponsors. Sorry, if you're watching the recording, you do have to be here in person. So that's motivation for you to show up. Must be present to win. Elastic is also sponsoring. They're the folks behind Elasticsearch, and they also have some gift cards that we will raffle when we're meeting in person. So we'll just hold on to those, and once we're back to in-person meetings, we'll make those available to folks. Intertech is a training company. If you look them up on their site, they have lots of training videos on all kinds of computer-related subjects. They sponsor the famous screaming flying monkeys. Oh, what are those? Well, they're like little dolls, and if you pull them, they have kind of an elastic cord to them, and when they bump up against the wall, they scream, as well as some coffee cups, mouse pads, and so forth. They're actually a lot of fun. Manning has been sponsoring ebooks for us, and so we'll be sponsoring 2 Manning ebooks at the end of this meeting for those who are still present. And also on occasion, Pearson will sponsor physical books to add to the raffle again when we're in person. So thank you to all of our JUG sponsors for making all of this possible. I do have some announcements. I talked before about that Gateway Software Symposium, that's otherwise known as No Fluff, Just Stuff. Well, guess what? The date changed. Still in St. Louis, still at the St. Louis Marriott West, 660 Maryville Center Drive in St. Louis, Missouri. But the date is now going to be April 1st and 2nd of next year. So they have moved that. Now you can attend either way you want to do it. You can attend in person or online. So if you want to find out more about that, just go to that address there at the bottom of the slide. That's just nofluffjuststuff.com/St. Louis if you want to know all the details. Now there's another conference coming up here in December, and that's jconf.dev. That's the Java conference December 8 through 10 in Chicago. As far as I'm able to tell, that one is in person only, but registration is now open. And if you want to go to that, you probably want to take advantage of some of those early bird registrations on that. And if you want to find out more, just again, go to that address there at the bottom of the slide, 2021.jconf.dev. It looks to be a really good conference. I recognize a lot of the speakers that they have listed. I've met many of them in person. So as far as upcoming presentations go, here's what our schedule is looking like as of today. So next month on November 11, we'll have event streaming. It's not just for events anymore, by Mike Yon of Hazelcast. So they have presented before and their presentations have been quite popular. As I mentioned before, we don't meet in December due to the holidays, but in January, come on back on the 13th, because an acquaintance of mine is Alan Barr of Veterans United Home Loans, and he'll be presenting a presentation on explaining why your internal developer platform is suboptimal. So that'll be good. So if you're really wanting to do something in December, well, check out that JConf conference in Chicago. Okay, so as far as upcoming presentations go, to get the latest schedule, you should always just go to this address here, meetup.com/gatewayjug. And as soon as we get a presentation scheduled, we just go ahead and just put it up on the meetup site, and that'll always give you the latest presentation schedule as we get them scheduled. Now, if you would like to give a presentation, or if you're interested in becoming a JUG sponsor, you can just email the rest of the steering committee at that same email address that I gave you before. That's javasigsc@ociweb.com. So that's the announcements that I have here for tonight. So tonight's presentation is Jakarta EE, Present and Future by Reza Rahman of Microsoft. And I'd like to thank him for coming. And also, I understand we're once again, for the second time, on the Fuj.io virtual JUG tour, and I think he'll have some things to say about that. So I'm going to click my stop sharing button, and when I do, that should allow you to take control and then share your screen. So why don't you take it away here, Reza?
So this is the first time I've used Zoom on this machine. I hope I can make this happen without needing to quit. Yes, I will need to quit and reopen. So I'll be right back.
There should be at the bottom. I've got on my screen. I've got them.
Just let me just minimize this window here. Put it in some hopefully harmless position right over there. Let me exit my email, which I just opened up just to get to this. Okay, so thank you very much for everyone for showing up. And if you're recording, also watching this recording, welcome and thank you for watching the recording. As Bruce mentioned before, my name is Reza Rahman. In my day job, I'm Principal Program Manager for Java on Azure at Microsoft. This is my off hours though, and in fact, I'm not really wearing my work hat at the moment. The hat I'm wearing at the moment is a Java EE, a Jakarta EE ambassador, and I will explain what the Jakarta EE ambassadors are in a moment also. But before I do that, I do want to thank the folks at Fujay for making this presentation, for arranging the presentation today. They do a pretty decent job, and basically this is fujay.com. I'll give you a little bit of a primer on fujay.com. Of course, of all the things that can happen, my seat is now not cooperating with me, so just give me a second. That should be sorted now. Apologies. Okay, so this is fujay.com. It stands for Friends of OpenJDK. Basically, if you've been in the Java ecosystem for a little while, back in the Sun days, there was a website called java.net. And it was basically a portal for all things Java. And this was not the first time this concept has been around. If you've been around even longer than that, you'll remember Java Lobby. And that was basically the portal, sort of online community for Java developers. So there'd be all kinds of things there, just like fujay.com has today, and it's basically trying to recreate java.net. And I know that because Girjan is my friend, and I know what he's trying to do here. So similar to java.net back in the day, you have sort of more curated articles, as you see here. There are surveys. There are some very nice tutorials that you can take a look at. There's a nice tutorial about all of the Java releases, for example. So there's an OpenJDK release roadmap here. There's an event calendar, so all manners of events on all over the place, all over the world on Java. This is a good place to do that. So you can see JAX London and some of the other things that are listed here. If you want to list yourself here, you can actually list yourself here also. So these are all of the different things that are there on fujay.com. So do check it out. It's a nice, it's a pretty nice website. All right. So without further ado, let me get into the presentation today. The presentation today is Jakarta EE, Present and Future. And of course, as you can see on the screen there is my contact information. So if there is anything that you want to engage with me on with regards to Jakarta EE, you can do so. In fact, that is one of the objectives of my talk today. It's as much about informing you as it is about engaging you on some of these important work that is going on with Jakarta EE that actually matters to all of us. Some of us may not realize that it does, but in fact it does. And I'll explain in a moment why that is. Now, the other thing I should mention is there is no reason to hold back Q&A at the very end, especially in JAG environments. I definitely don't do that. Feel free to just ask away your questions if you have any. I don't really mind, just come off mute and ask your question. I know there's a chat function. It's a little bit difficult to look at the chat while you're also presenting. So just do me a favor and just come off mute and just ask your question that way. Otherwise, towards the end, I'll take a look at the chat and see if there's any questions questions there that I need to address. This talk is more or less a state of the union of Jakarta EE. So I'll talk a little bit about what is there in the present, but I'll also talk about what's coming in the future. And I'll also talk about how you can get involved in helping create that future, actually. Okay, so before I move forward, one thing I should explain is what exactly is Jakarta EE. And hopefully most of you are already aware of this, but just in case you are not aware, Jakarta EE is basically the technology formerly known as Java EE. Java EE used to be managed at the JCP for a number of years. In fact, I have been involved in the JCP and Java EE for a very long time, almost 10 or 15 years, ever since basically Java EE5. So now, while the JCP is really good and Java SE or Java, the language, is still defined in the JCP, the problem, if you really look at it, is that JCP is actually not an independent organization. The JCP is merely a department of Oracle. So there are definite limitations. Oracle has veto power in the JCP. And in the end, most of the IP actually belongs to Oracle if you're working within the JCP. So that is not as open as it really should be for a language like Java and a technology like Java. So Java EE moving to the Eclipse Foundation is a really big deal. Frankly, this is one of the largest and most important, in my opinion, technology transitions that has happened in the Java ecosystem. So now you have this really large part of what used to be the Java platform now moved to a foundation under really open governance. Everything is open source. Most importantly, the TCK is open source. So it used to be that you have to pay Sun or Oracle a lot of money to get certified and get a compatible implementation of Java EE or Jakarta EE. That is no longer the case. Anyone can get certified in the Eclipse Foundation, and the TCK is developed in the open. And actually, the TCK project happens to be led by Red Hat these days. It's not even led by Oracle. But it is while it is still moved into the open source domain, it is not an open source project. It is still very much a specification. So there is a well-defined specification process. There is a clear IP flow. All the IP in the end is actually in the hands of Eclipse Foundation, a non-profit rather than a specific company. It is completely vendor neutral, so everybody has a level playing field. And while this transition process has been going on for a little while, really we have not lost anyone in the transition process. So all of the key stakeholders that were there in Java EE still remain in Jakarta EE. And in fact, frankly, I see a lot more multilateral input and multilateral contribution into Java EE as a technology, or Jakarta EE as a technology. And that's, I think, incredibly important. Now, one of the things that all of us in this transition, one of the things we were hoping to accomplish is to encourage more end users to participate, more people like yourselves to participate in the Java EE or Jakarta EE development process. I have to say, I have not seen much of that happen, and that is really very unfortunate to see. So one of the things I hope I will try to accomplish as part of this presentation is try to get you to think about contributing into this very important technology that really is very critical to the longevity of the Java platform. So if you want to find out more about Jakarta EE, the place to start is jakarta.ee, very nice URL, I think, and very easy to remember. You can start there and basically, take a look at the specification itself, who is implementing it, who is involved, how you get involved and contribute yourself, and so on. Okay. So before we move too much forward, one of the things I did want to address is the fundamental importance of Jakarta EE as a technology. And I have to be honest, there's a lot of FUD around Java EE, and there a lot of FUD around Jakarta EE that continues. Some of it is good faith, frankly, some of it is not. So I would like to encourage buyer beware when you hear a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt around Jakarta EE. I give us a separate talk on why Jakarta EE is so important. But let's set all of that aside in terms of why Jakarta EE is important to us from a conceptual standpoint, in terms of having a healthy vendor-neutral ecosystem in Java, especially in enterprise Java. Just numerically speaking, Jakarta EE continues to be very important. In fact, many people are dependent on Jakarta EE, and really it's fundamentally important in maintaining the health and well-being of so many different things in the ecosystem. People, frankly, just don't realize it. That in fact, they are dependent on Jakarta EE and Java EE in some way. The first element of this is there's a perception out there that somehow, nobody is using Jakarta EE compatible application servers anymore. Believe it or not, in my job, I see this very differently. What happens is that the people that are using these application servers are not the type of folks that are very vocal in like Twitter or Reddit and so on. They just have mission critical systems that they deploy on these platforms, and they continue to use them. So this shows up when you actually do surveys, industry surveys, and these people weigh in. And then you see numerically that there's this invisible bunch of people that, depending on the survey, is at least a quarter or more than a third of the Java developers that are using one or more of these Jakarta EE compatible runtimes. And in fact, the graphic that you see here is from the 2020 Jakarta EE developer survey, probably the most Java EE-centric survey, industry survey out there, but still a very large one. Like over, I think, 1,500 people participate in the survey. That is nothing to sneeze at in terms of numbers. And of course, because it's a Jakarta EE survey, it is a higher end number. Typically, it's between 35 and 40%. I think that's probably, as I said, the upper bound of how many people actually use Jakarta EE application servers. I think the average and the truth is somewhere around 25 to 35%. Now, whether or not you're using a Jakarta EE application server, the reality is you are still very, very dependent at the end of the day on one or more Jakarta EE technologies. So whether you're using Spring, Tomcat, Hibernate, ActiveMQ, Jetty, Microprofile, Quarkus, all of these things are directly dependent on Jakarta EE APIs. They build on Jakarta EE APIs or implement Jakarta EE APIs. Without this part of the ecosystem being healthy, indirectly, that will affect the health of these parts of the Java ecosystem as well. And these comprise a very large portion of the Java ecosystem. When you really look at it, when there's surveys that actually measure this question, it is close to 70 to 80% of Java developers that in the end, in one way or the other, actually are dependent on Java EE or Jakarta EE as a technology. Now, the Jakarta EE ecosystem, as we'll talk about in a second, is also evolving. It has always been evolving, frankly speaking. And the newest evolution in the Jakarta EE ecosystem space is Quarkus and Microprofile. So these, Quarkus in particular, is enjoying pretty healthy adoption pretty rapidly. So this is a very brand new technology. It is, as I'll talk about towards the sort of middle part of the presentation, this will eventually most likely become a Jakarta EE compatible runtime and open up a whole bunch of other possibilities of how Jakarta EE runtimes are supposed to look like. But as of today, it is definitely very much a runtime that has gotten very rapid adoption for good reasons. All right, so let's move forward. And for some reason, this slide, Zoom is always unhappy about scrolling slide decks. So let's move to the next slide. This is about the Jakarta E evolution. Obviously, Jakarta E has been around for a very, very long time. I've been around, I've been involved in it since the Java E5 timeframe. The latest is what we want to look at right now. So the latest edition of Jakarta E right now is Jakarta E 9.1. Jakarta E8 is what was transferred to the Eclipse Foundation. It is binary compatible with Java E8 as a release. So the big thing that, and a very important thing that happened with Jakarta E8 is really to transition into open source and transition into open governance. Now, Jakarta E9 is for the most part about namespace transition. So you've noticed that the name has changed from Java EE to Jakarta EE. The reason for this is that Java continues to be a trademark that Oracle wants to hold on to. So we needed to rename this platform to something else. And the community chose the name Jakarta. If you know about what Jakarta is, it actually is a very historically important name in the open source Java ecosystem. Tomcat and a number of other important libraries back in the early days of Sun were actually put into the open source under Apache Jakarta. So this is a very, very symbolically important name. And I think the community chose well in terms of choosing Jakarta EE as a name. So similar to the name itself, the package names, as you probably are aware, all of the Java EE package names are basically under the javax space. So that namespace needed to also change. And that is really what has happened in Jakarta E9. Jakarta E9 was really about transitioning the namespace from one to the other and really decoupling from Oracle, even in terms of branding and copyrights. Now, Jakarta E10, which will come about probably early next year, is when you will begin to see enhancements and innovation. So this is so far what we've done is we've taken probably one of the largest technology transitions ever in our industry and make that successful. And Jakarta E10 will be the proof in the pudding in terms of what happens and how innovation changes in the technology with Jakarta E10. And a lot of my presentation today will actually look at what the possibilities are for Jakarta E10. And again, going back to my point before, how you as an end user developer should consider joining and actually helping and making Jakarta E10 actually happen. Now, before I move forward, I did want to take a look at Jakarta E8 at a glance. The reason for this is that more or less even Jakarta E9 is basically Jakarta E8 with a separate namespace. The reason Java EE developers, basically people that adopt, and I work with a number of them on a day-to-day basis, the reason they have been okay with this transition is two reasons. Number one, Jakarta E8 was actually a very, very solid release. If you're not writing microservices and you're writing a monolithic application, you're actually in very, very good shape with Jakarta E8. Basically, it's pretty feature complete. Now, what has also happened is that the stakeholders that were around the Java EE namespace, Java EE ecosystem, realize that this transition is going to take some time. So in order to continue innovation, and in particularly in order to solve the problem of fine-grained microservices, what they did was they spun up a separate specification effort called microprofile. And that's another reason why it's been okay, even though Jakarta is in transition, it's been okay because microprofile, when you look at it, actually is fairly feature complete also, and actually addresses most of the common concerns you may have in terms of developing microservices. Obviously, I won't cover microprofile too much today. Hopefully, you'll have another speaker come in and maybe do a microprofile introduction for you so that you'll see the types of specifications that are targeted towards microservices development. Now, Jakarta E8 basically addresses web standards alignment. So there's some important innovations like HTTP2, server-sent events, JSON binding, aligning with JSON pointer, which is another standard, aligning with JSON patch, which is another JSON standard. JSON, by the way, is another standard also. There was some CDI alignment work that was done. So EJB has been the programming model in Jakarta EE or Java EE for a while. As we go along, we're going to shift away from EJB and use CDI as the de facto programming model. So we've been continually doing more and more work towards that. So CDI2 did a lot, was a very solid release in that regard. And also even things like JSF and JPA, or now it's called Jakarta Persistence. And I'll explain the naming in just a moment. These have also aligned themselves with CDI more and more, and there'll be more and more of this alignment to do. Simplicity has been a theme for Java EE for a very, very long time. And probably the best example of this in terms of Jakarta E8 is a security API. Because of the Jakarta E8 security API, I'd argue that Jakarta EE actually has the simplest way of securing applications. Now, similarly, the Jakarta EE or Java E8 platform has always aligned itself with innovations in Java SE. The greatest example of this is probably annotations. So I don't know how many of you are really aware, but it was actually Java EE5 that was a proof of concept of how a mainstream technology can use annotations as its metadata model. In fact, I'd argue that Java EE does a better job of adopting annotations than pretty much any other technology out there still for that reason. However, in Jakarta E8, the alignment was more with Java SE8, namely things like repeatable annotations, the datetime API, streams, and completable futures. If you want to look at how these things look like in action when it is adopted by a platform, you can just take a look at Jakarta E8 as an example. So things like Jakarta Faces, Jakarta Persistence, Jakarta REST, Bean Validation, they have all adopted these Java SE innovations in a relatively elegant way. Now, if you're talking about Java EE, you're probably more familiar with acronyms like JPA or JSF or JaxRS and the like. One of the things that has happened in the transition to Jakarta EE is, we really took a look at it and we said, like, why are we using these acronyms? These acronyms make it more difficult for people to understand what these technologies are about. So instead of using acronyms, really what we're doing with Jakarta is just use a single word to describe the technology. So instead of JSF, it's simply Jakarta Faces or simply Faces. Similarly, Jakarta Persistence with JPA, Jakarta Rest instead of JaxRS, and so on and so forth.
Question.
Yeah.
Yeah, you were using CDI on the previous slide. Is that do with dependency injection and
Correct. It's standardized dependency injection baked into the platform as of EE6. Yeah, so that is basically the de facto component model. Certainly going forward, it'll basically replace all of the other competing component models that we have in Jakarta E, namely EJB.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, so Jakarta E9 and 9.1, as I said, is basically all about moving the namespace and decoupling from the javax or the Java brand. So the new namespace is Jakarta, and this was a very big deal. And there's some other changes that has happened, like removal of some old technologies, adapting for Java SE 9 and Java SE 11 in particular. So there's some changes that need to happen there because Java SE 9 wound up dropping things like JaxP, so they need to be re-added into the platform. So that's why Jakarta EE 9.1 is compatible with Java SE 11, okay, as opposed to Java SE 8, which did have those pruned APIs still, and the like. But this is actually a very important thing. So what that means is the entire ecosystem actually needs to shift away from the Java namespace into the Jakarta namespace. Even if you're using something like Spring, even if you're using something like Tomcat, you need to deal with this namespace migration. Now, luckily, a lot of the runtimes are doing this by supporting both namespaces at the same time. And there's also migration tools available to begin to do this migration. So even if you don't do anything else, you will be in, even if you don't quote unquote use a Jakarta application server, you will need to do something to adapt to this namespace change. So you should definitely begin looking at this now and possibly begin your migration now ahead of Jakarta E10, where you may also be dealing with innovations and API changes instead of just changing the namespace. So there is, as I said, we've retained basically most of the ecosystem as it is, and in fact, we'll be expanding it. I'll talk about the Jakarta EE core profile in a moment, and that will definitely expand the ecosystem. But basically, these are all of the implementations that we had before in Java EE, all of the main ones. And in fact, we've expanded the number of implementations. So this is the very first time that I have seen with Jakarta EE 8 and 9 onward, that the number of implementations have expanded. If you remember back in early 90s, 2000, there were literally dozens of Java EE implementations. So with 5 and up to 7, we saw these kind of boil down to what we have on my screen at the moment. And if you click on the compatibility matrix, you'll actually see that there's more. So that's finally growing the number of Jakarta EE implementation, and that is very, very encouraging. Okay, so let's talk about Jakarta E10. We talked about Jakarta E8, talked a little bit about Jakarta E9. Jakarta E10 is what is in the works right now and what is happening right at this moment. So we in the Jakarta EE ambassadors, and I'll talk about the Jakarta EE ambassadors in a moment. We're basically formed because of what we were seeing in terms of Oracle's development, slowing down development for Java EE8. We were originally called the Java EE Guardians. We've since renamed ourselves as Jakarta EE Ambassadors. And we are basically a grassroots group of people that evangelize the platform and try to advance the platform in any way that we can, including contributing directly into specifications. So while we are seeing this transition from Jakarta E8 and Jakarta E9, what we asked ourselves is what innovations do we really want to see out of the platform? What is needed? What are the gaps? In order to facilitate things like Jakarta E10 and hopefully even Jakarta E11. So what we did was we wrote down all of our ideas, we vetted it into the community, and we created a contributor's guide to Jakarta E10. So if you are interested in contributing to Jakarta E, this is the thing you need to look at. It'll tell you in a lot of detail what some of the possibilities are and how you can go about contributing, the different ways of contributing. So the rest of this section today is really about giving you a Cliff's Notes version of what is actually in the Jakarta E10 contributor guide, but the link here is on the slide deck. So these are the themes as we see it. There's going to continue to need to be CDI alignment, as I mentioned. So there's a number of things that are still in the EJB specification, things like at asynchronous, at schedule, at lock, at max concurrency, message-driven beans, roles allowed, run as. These are all important bits of functionality that are more or less tied to the EJB programming model. They're available in the platform today. You can use them, but you have to use EJB to do that. So if you were to unify the platform around CDI, you need to rewrite these things in somewhere else, right? Put it in some other specification and re-implement them in terms of CDI. So that is a lot of this work is actually happening right now. And this is something that we see is necessary to happen. And in fact, in most of these specifications, there's actually general agreement that this should happen, namely the security specification as well as the concurrency specification. There's also better CDI support, and I'll tell you what I mean by this in a moment. We need better CDI support and alignment in some of the specifications like Jakarta REST, batch, and concurrency. You also need a little bit of Java SE alignment that's residual. Namely, one of the APIs that really didn't propagate as much as it should have been is Completable Future. So you can use Completable Futures in Java EE applications today, but you cannot use them in a managed way. So that gap is actually being addressed right now as well, and it definitely is going to be addressed in Jakarta E10. Similarly, you can have Java SE bootstrap APIs for things like REST and messaging. So today, these APIs are basically tied to Jakarta runtimes themselves. So there is definitely a use case for decoupling these technologies and making them available so that you can just run them in Java SE. That is, I think, fundamentally important because we want the platform to be used, want these technologies to be used outside of application servers. That is, I think, has been one of the secret sauces of why Jakarta EE is relevant, because it's not just about an all or nothing proposition. You can use piecemeal these technologies if you so wish. And also, similarly, it used to be that the TCK was one large thing. So you have to implement every specification in Jakarta EE. So similarly, another bit of important work is decoupling and modularizing each of the TCKs so you can certify just one technology. So you can say, hey, I just want to implement Jakarta REST, or I just want to implement concurrency. So that ought to be possible. There are some standardization gaps. These are things that are available in proprietary vendor-specific ways. The objective of a standard is to minimize these vendor-specific things. So there are some cases of that. I'll explain in a moment. I'll show you some examples. So there's things in security, batch concurrency, transactions that we can definitely standardize far better. Now, one of the more important things is the core or microservices profile. And again, microprofile and runtimes like Quarkus do this in a proprietary way today. They already kind of sort of do what the core or microservices profile is intended to do. So hopefully in Jakarta E10, we will actually standardize exactly what that means. And there is some innovation that needs to come in also. We'll talk about some new standards. Generally, in open standards, you don't want to do wild innovation. You do want to be more conservative, but there is some new APIs that definitely make sense to add into the platform. And three examples of that would be NoSQL, MVC, and configuration. And I'll talk about those very briefly as we move forward also. Okay. Yeah, is there a question?
Yeah, I saw a question in chat. Simply, what is the different for standards for Java EE8 versus Jakarta EE8 as a term, like servlet, JMS, persistence, etc.?
There's none. These are binary compatible. In Jakarta E10, they're entirely binary compatible. So the only difference is that whereas JPA, for example, as was part of Java EE8, and that was developed by the JCP, whereas Jakarta persistence is part of Jakarta EE8 and is in the Eclipse Foundation, so in open governance. Now, in terms of Jakarta E9, Jakarta persistence will have that package name change. And of course, going forward, it's going to be called Jakarta persistence or Jakarta REST. Servlet will retain the name servlet. It's simple enough. There's no reason to mess with that. In fact, the official name will be Jakarta Servlet, but I suspect most people will simply continue to refer to it as servlet. Okay, so these are some of the changes in Jakarta concurrency. Again, we want things like asynchronous at schedule and at lock to be part of CDI. Max concurrency is something that has been implicitly sort of there tied to EJB. It makes sense to create a separate annotation for that. Similarly, you can define managed executors today, but you have to do that in vendor proprietary ways, typically using proprietary XML deployment descriptors. You can very easily create an annotation like the one I have an example of on the slide. This is similar to how data sources and JMS resources are defined today. It's just a single annotation definition of the resources. Used to be, even for JMS and JDBC resources, those used to be defined in proprietary ways also. Already talked about Completable Future. So again, this is creating a Java EE version of Completable Future that you can use reliably in a managed environment. Similarly, Cdi Context Propagation is another piece that is actually happening just as we speak. I saw the pull requests happening even today. So this is definitely going to be, a lot of this is actually, I believe, going to be addressed in Jakarta E10 already. Okay, so here's an example of moving at asynchronous from EJB to CDI. So I don't want to go over it too much. It's, I think, relatively self-explanatory if you take a look at the code example. So this is very much like the way EJB works today. So let's say you have a long-running method. You don't have to deal with the mechanics of asynchrony. So you just put in the asynchronous annotation and you can return a completable future. And then you do whatever you're going to do in your asynchronous code. And then you return a completable future. Now, on the client side, you don't have to wait for this long-running process to happen in the process payment method. In the client side, you can simply return a stub of the completable future right away, just as you may when you make the initial invocation to the process payment method. And because ultimately you will be returning a completable future, when that completable future is actually returned for real is when you can move forward with something like then accept method. So messaging is another one, formerly called JMS, now called Jakarta Messaging. Message-driven beans are relatively popular in Java EE applications. So it makes sense to break that out from EJB also and have just a simple annotation like something called message listener that works with CDI instead. Similarly, JMS does not have a standalone API today. You can very easily create one. It makes sense to have standalone JMS implementations that are outside of application servers. In fact, there's a number of those already. So it makes sense to have a simple bootstrap API to do that. There's no reason, for example, that a subset of JMS could not be applicable to Kafka. Kafka is really nothing much more than really just a subset and few enhancements over JMS. Similarly, JMS today does not standardize what the wire protocol is. In other words, what does a client and a server, JMS server, actually speak? They usually speak proprietary protocol. So that can be standardized to use AMQP. In fact, something like ActiveMQ, they do that already today. They use AMQP as a wire protocol. So that could be standardized. Here's an example of message listener. I don't want to go too much into it. Again, it's relatively self-explanatory, I believe. So this could be just a CDI bean as opposed to a message-driven bean. It could be given any scope, but it could be, for example, application scope. It could work with the max concurrency annotation to limit concurrency in a standardized way. And of course, you can add a lot of syntactic sugar once you move to this model from the EJB model. So you could be adding things like batching, retry delays, ordering, and the like. Okay, so these are more or less proprietary features today that application servers provide in a proprietary fashion. But a lot of this, again, could be very easily standardized and implemented in this way. Jakarta Security is an important one. So I think, again, one of the, I would say, nicer APIs in Java EE as of Java E8. I think, again, it really makes security very simple compared to pretty much anything else that's out there. So there are some minor enhancements that I think is actually being done, again, in Jakarta Security. And this is supporting roles allowed and run as outside of EJB in CDI-based environments. And also today, as of right now, Java EE Security standardizes support for arbitrary security providers, databases, and LDAP. Again, right now, the idea is to add more modern authentication mechanisms like OAuth, OpenID Connect, and JWT. So here's a few examples of that, and it very much looks like that same pattern of defining resources, if you will. This is very similar to how you define a authentication provider for LDAP and database. And in fact, this syntax I literally copied from Payara. The Payara folks already do this in a proprietary way. And it's very similar to, for example, how OpenLiberty does configuration of these authentication providers also. Here are some other possibilities. So Jakarta persistence is fairly mature, but there's some things that could be added. So you could make, for example, the persistence.xml optional in many cases. You could add more SQL-like features like sub-selects that are not supported in JPQL today. You could add JCache as a second-level cache provider. Today, it's basically a mechanism that's specific to JPA. There's no reason that those caches could not, second-level caches could not be externalized using JCache as an API. Jakarta REST, again, has its own injection mechanism called add context. This is actually happening. This has already happened, this change. So now they've shifted over to using @inject in CDI instead of using add context. Jakarta REST could have a bootstrap API. This has not yet happened. It could support support for multi-part form data, and this has actually happened also as well. So Jakarta Batch, again, this work is happening as we speak. Jakarta Batch, all of the Jakarta Batch artifacts are now CDI aware. And the one thing that still hasn't happened yet, but I hope will happen, is you define batch jobs in Jakarta using XML these days still. And one nice enhancement that already is in implementations like JBarray, which OpenLiberty and JBoss support and Wildfly supports, is basically defining these jobs in a Java API as opposed to an XML API. Jakarta Transactions, or JTA, is another one. When people think of JTA, they think it's something heavyweight. It does two-phase authentication, it's slow, and so on and so forth. The reality of JTA is that majority of modern implementations like Wildfly, OpenLiberty, even WebLogic actually apply quite a few optimizations. So in fact, most of the time when you're applying JPA, you're not doing two-phase authentication at all. It's really one-phase authentication. So those kind of optimization, instead of vendors doing them in a vendor-specific way, those could just be baked into the standard and make them required, those optimizations. Okay, so Jakarta MVC is one of the ones that are potentially new APIs. So JSF will continue to, is the presentation layer framework today. in Java EE and has been there for a very long time. I'm personally, I'm a very big fan of JSF, and I continue to be. But what people have asked for is a version of a web framework that is looks a lot more like REST. So it does not have the abstractions that make JSF very productive. So this request is met basically by the Jakarta MVC specification, and this is a mature specification. It is already there. It is just a matter of adding it to the platform, and really that is all that is necessary. Basically, what Jakarta MVC does is that it reuses many of the JaxRS annotations, and basically just a few annotations like add controller to define a backend controller, add view to bind a controller to a view definition language, let's say facelets or JSP or what have you, and injecting what's called a model. So you can reference basically whatever in EL, your objects from the backend into the front end. So if you're writing, let's say, a library homepage, you could be querying all of your books from a backend book service, like in the example, put it into the model and be able to reference books in your expression language, either in your JSTL, JSP, or facelets page. So Jakarta Nosql is basically just like JDBC and JPA, standardized access to relational databases. Jakarta Nosql, its aim is to standardize NoSQL access for Jakarta EE developers, and it does this in a very clever way. Basically, it has 2 degrees of flexibility. On one hand, it basically recognizes that there are different kinds of NoSQL databases, 4 different kinds in particular: key value, column, graph, and document. And it also provides multiple layers of APIs. So there's a communication API similar to JDBC. There's a mapping on template API similar to JPA. And then there's a repository API similar to Spring.JPA or DeltaSpec. So here's an example of that. So the mapping annotations in all cases look very much like JPA. There's a few nuances specific to each NoSQL family, but it's mostly very, very JPA-like. And in fact, even the templating language or the templating APIs for each of these look very similar to JPA, the JPA entity manager, with nuances of that particular database. So here you see an example of an object database, right? So that you're getting a document, but it's very much like a JPA criteria query for the most part. Okay, configuration is another important part of the ecosystem that has been a long-standing gap. We've been talking about standardizing configuration since Java EE6. So the basic idea here is to externalize configuration. Today, you can create configuration within the application in Java EE applications in either XML or annotations. But the idea here is to read configuration data from outside the application. So these could be maybe property files, Java system properties, environment variables, these days Kubernetes secrets, cloud storage like Azure Configuration Service, or even NoSQL stores. So the pattern should be that once you have something like this, you ought to be able to basically read these configuration values from these various data sources and either be able to inject them, like I have on the slide example, be able to reference them in some way in property files, just like this, and have the property files themselves be written in this sort of name value syntax, or be able to reference these properties within the application configuration, like the web XML or application XML or egvjar.xml, as I have in the example here. So this work actually is happening, and this is again something that is progressing as we speak, and hopefully will be standardized by the time of early next year. And some of this work, at least I'm hoping the basic injection into Java code, that will at least be possible. Maybe even reference in the XML may also be possible. So this functionality already is available in microprofile. So this actually is just being moved from microprofiling into Jakarta EE. All right. So the core profile is worth talking about. So if you looked at microprofile basically says that microprofile runtimes should support a small subset of Java EE, not the entire platform, namely RESTful services, APIs for doing JSON processing, as well as CDI, essentially. So what the core profile does is basically standardizes that concept. So this is the contents of the web profile. So again, it includes REST, it includes JSON, includes expression language to be able to do the kind of thing that we saw, like be able to reference configuration files within XML, annotations and interceptors. That's really just related to dependency injection for the most part, as well as CDI, as well as configuration. So that is the idea, that basically a core profile runtime should support at least these technologies, maybe more. So if you look at Quarkus, in reality, Quarkus just starts with these basic technologies in Jakarta EE, but in reality, Quarkus actually supports the majority of Java EE APIs, including things like batch and the like.
Excuse me.
Yes.
What about security inside of this core? There's no security inside of this core right now.
Yes.
When you use like Quarkus, you could use Spring security inside of it, but it's not the core.
That's right. So the idea is to create the absolute bare minimum of what you would need to write a very simple application. So nothing much more than, the idea here is minimalism. So the expectation definitely is that each of these runtimes will likely support a lot more than what the core profile requires. But the basic idea is that it need not do that if it does not want to. So typically Quarkus, my guess is, will wind up supporting Jakarta Security semantics. But Helidon does exactly that. Its security mechanism is nothing much more than Jakarta Security, but it is not required. That's the whole idea, is that you ought to be able to write, if you like, a runtime that starts with the absolute bare minimum, and then you can add whatever else that you want in a modular fashion. So I definitely think Quarkus and Helidon will be initial runtimes that implement the core profile. I am hopeful that Micronaut will do the same thing. In fact, we've seen the Micronaut folks get involved in what's called CDI Lite. So if you notice in the core profile does not implement CDI full. It will implement CDI Lite, which is actually makes it possible to have a compatible implementation of CDI that conforms to things like Graal and native compilation. The full CDI actually depends on things like reflection. So CDI Lite does not. So in fact, we've seen the Micronaut folks get involved in the definition of CDI Lite, and even get involved in some fine tuning for bean validation, so that API can also be essentially do what it needs to do without reflection. So I am fairly certain CDI at least will support CDI, which I think is going to be a big win already. It may even be possible that down the line, Micronaut will also implement the entire core profile, which means this is an entirely new class or different kinds of Jakarta EE runtimes, and it expands the definition of what it actually means to be a compatible Jakarta EE runtime. Okay, so ways of contributing. Here are the things you can do. You can simply follow technologies that interest you. This is a link to do that. It contains a mailing list for every single technology that is in development, every single specification that is in development, and you can simply enlist in all of these mailing lists and simply keep track of what's going on and share your opinion. That is an invaluable contribution, believe it or not. Very few people do that in practice, other than a small number of us that are core Jakarta EE ambassadors. Now, if you want a specific change, so all of these things that I talked about, and maybe other things and things that I didn't mention that is in the contributor guide, you could become a champion for a change of that particular feature. And the way you do that is you log on onto the project itself and either create a ticket help implement something, and so on. Okay, so and the way you do that is simply signing the ECA. In order to just do a simple PR, you do not need any other paperwork other than simply signing this one online form called the ECA or Eclipse Contributor Agreement. It takes 5 minutes to do. There is more paperwork if you want to be a committer, but very few of us, in fact, need be committers. You simply issue your PR, the committer will take a look at it and merge it, and that is perfectly fine. You can engage if you take a look at any of this and you're feeling lost, or if you have a question, you can always engage the Jakarta EE ambassadors, and we will help you. Become a contributor. And if you don't want to do any of that, you want to do something as simple as just take this presentation that I'm doing today and maybe present it to another JUG, or present it at a conference, or even present it at your company, that is something you can do. Or write a simple blog entry that, hey, I tried migrating to Jakarta E9 and this was my experience. These are all legitimate things and ways, many different ways of contributing to this important technology set. So in summary, Jakarta E8, 9, and 9.1 are very significant, whether you realize it or not. You really should take it seriously, and we should do everything we can to make this endeavor successfully. This is a very important step for the longevity of the Java platform. Making this successful, I believe, will mean that enterprise Java will remain a strong ecosystem with many different vendors and a strong competitive landscape, probably for the next 10 years. Whereas if we cannot make this succeed, I very much worry what is going to happen in terms of competitiveness and vendor neutrality in the Java ecosystem going forward. So there's a lot of important changes in Jakarta E10 that is possible. And again, remember that some of us worked very, very hard to make this thing happen. And our hope was and is that you will get involved and do what we were hoping, is expand the kind of people and the number of people that contribute to such a foundational piece. Frankly, this would be another source of strength in the Java community if we are able to make it happen, because it will mean that a very large and significant part of the Java ecosystem is actually end user driven. Is driven not by vendors, but actually end users help define and develop what this technology should look like. So here's some resources that I'll leave you with. And in fact, this slide deck is already available on my speaker deck account. I will post a link to my speaker deck account and link to this presentation. You can download the PDF right away. If you want the source PowerPoint, let me know. I will make the source PowerPoint available to you also. Just need to reach out to me, and I'll leave my contact information here also. There's a number of ways you can contact me very easily. So I'll leave you with these links. Feel free to take a look at them. If you do one thing, I hope you will go and follow the Jakarta EE Twitter handle and do much more than that, and hopefully get engaged in this technology set. So that is it for today. I'm going to stop sharing and just share those links with you. I will take a look at the chat in just a moment. And then in the meanwhile, yeah, feel free to come off mute and have a dialogue with me about any of this.
How do you feel that the modularization is going to evolve in the long run? Is there going to be any effort to try to move to the Java module system for all of these dependencies, as opposed to the way you've been doing it now? I'm referring to those Project Jigsaw modules. I think that was the code name for it originally.
Okay, so I did share my speaker deck account and also my contact information. Hopefully everyone got those. So modularity. Frankly speaking, it's a bit too late. I used to be a proponent of the Java module system, or JPMS, for a number of years. In fact, when I was in Sun Oracle, I had a lot of high hopes for JPMS, because JPMS is really what Java module system should have been 10 years ago. The issue is that there's two issues. Number one, JPMS came a bit too late for the Java EE ecosystem in particular, and even beyond. So if you look at Java EE runtimes today, they are already modular. Majority of them are modular, but they use their own ways of doing modularity. So for example, Liberty uses OSGI. Glassfish or Payara uses OSGI. JBoss uses a JBoss module system. Things like Quarkus and Spring Boot do modularization effectively via Maven, more or less. Right? They use Maven as their module system. It is asking a bit too much for these runtimes to double back and basically adopt Java module system as a de facto module system. Right? It will take a lot of re-engineering for that to happen. That's one thing. The other problem is that JPMS does not appear to really be even geared towards the broader Java community. It seems to be mostly an effort to modularize the JDK itself. So it is lacking a lot of features like dynamic loading, for example. So it is difficult for something as robust as an application server or a runtime platform to really make use of it. Same thing it can be said of JLink, right? If JLink had arrived perhaps 5 years ago, right, there was a fighting chance that the frameworks of today would have used JLink and JPMS as their ways of doing modularity instead of going the proprietary sort of Maven-based direction that we are going at the moment. So I fear that it's a bit too late for JPMS.
Okay. And how do you see all of this evolving when it comes to native compilation with Graal, when the dependencies are just actually executable binaries as opposed to, say, char files and war files and things like that?
So here's what I think will happen. I think Graal is sort of an intermediate stage of where Java is. It never really made sense for Java to decouple the runtime and the executable. Java should have always done native executables instead of forcing the user to install yet another runtime just to execute an application essentially. So I do think that what we call native compilation today is probably the way forward. Graal VM right now is very limiting. So the fact that it does not support reflection is a very big problem. Right? It really limits what you can do as a framework developer. So I do think,
don't you save so much speed by removing that reflection? And that was the whole point of the minimal footprint that Quarkus, as its core, was gunning at. Graal VM is meant to be more than just Java. It should run Node, Python. It's a polyglot more at its core than it is just for Java.
Sure, but honestly, I have not seen much uptake for the polyglot aspect of it, and I don't see that being really a focus for the JVM. That was the Sun did that stuff back in the 2000. Were like, sometimes you do have to take your stand, and frankly, the JVM languages, they, in my opinion, have come and gone. I think Java should just focus on doing Java well, as opposed to trying to be everything for everyone.
Latency is a cost. Memory is a cost. And these are the things that I think that the core of Quarkus brings to the forefront in its best of breed, more than I think than anything than the Liberty profile that I thought was the whole idea of the composable JEE container Maybe it didn't have Maven or the other types of deployments, but it had something that was composable. Now, when we're talking about compiling different sources and getting something that is secure, fast, no latency, small memory footprint, Micronaut and Quarkus is the future, honestly, in my view.
I frankly don't think so. The reason being that, like having seen Micronaut and Quarkus in action and having spoken to some of the folks that are using this in production today,
Serverless.
It really does
Serverless.
hurt.
It saves money. Serverless saves money, and that's why it's there.
Okay, it really does hurt to not being able to use the things that come with reflection. And in reality,
I agree, but that's the cost. It's choice.
It's a choice. That's right. I would say I agree with that point. If you're really that concerned about maybe just a few megs of memory here and there, or a little bit of disk space here and there, then yes. But frankly, a large amount of applications that we see even on Azure don't have concerns. Memory and CPU and hard disk, these are largely commodities. What is not a commodity is developer time. So you have to make sure to optimize for what makes developers' life easier rather than something like, let me try to save a little bit of memory and CPU.
And you agree, smaller is better. Smaller is better, and therefore it helps the developer, yes?
Again, I beg to differ. I think what we ought to be focusing, hardware, especially on something like the cloud, this basic raw computer power is a commodity. What we should focus on is how can we provide rich APIs for developers. I think that's true of the majority of the developers. That's why one of my favorite phrases from James Gosling is Java is the language of the blue collar developer. You don't have to be you have minimized complexity so that almost everyone can develop reasonably robust systems using Java. And I think limiting things like reflection goes in the opposite direction.
And I just agree that it's a choice. And if you don't need it, why have it? And the whole idea of the composable JE server goes to the whole point of making choices. If you don't need it, jettison it. Unless you have a very specific need. And I don't know anybody directly that as a developer says, I must have reflection. No. It might come to them and say, oh, well, I need to discover this API, and therefore I have to reflect on this class to figure out what it is on the fly. I think that is in the minor case. And when you see that you have to write RESTful things and create serverless things and use this stuff, I think that's more of smaller is better, speed is faster, smaller memory is better.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I like I said, I agree with the statement that different stroke for different folks. I think people value different things.
Yeah, I've got a question. Maybe I can get here and maybe make add a third opinion. I hate reflection because you get into a situation where if you add a field in there, you have to support it forever, even though it might be private. And reflection just sort of breaks the object-oriented thing. Maybe what we need is some sort of method that says, what are the methods, publicly available methods in your class? What are the publicly available getters and setters? And then we could use that in lieu of reflection. Because I have frustration with using Jackson because I've got this field that's, maybe the sum of two different fields or concatenation of two different strings. And all of a sudden I have to write individual getters and setters for that instead of being able to do, something synthetic.
So that's a good idea. So here's what I would suggest. Just like Java EE can evolve, Java SE also has an open evolutionary process, right? So I suggest actually jumping on to the OpenJDK list and having the discussion with the folks that are developing these APIs. right? So yeah, so I think, I'm never, as I said, when I talk to folks that are trying to going from Java EE in particular, and even Spring developers that are trying to evaluate Quarkus, their biggest headache is the lack of the lack of facilities for reflection.
I had a second question I was thinking about along the round of faces is that at present, there's no mechanism that I'm aware of. For instance, if you're in Eclipse or a web browser during development, to say, oh, I'm inserting this, I want to insert this variable that was passed to me, and there's no mechanism to say, hey, well, that wasn't passed to you in the view, or you're spelling it differently than it was passed to you in the view in the model and in the Spring MVC. You may spell donuts differently, or whatever it is. You may have, and you may pull, have a character, have an extra character or forget a character in a variable, and that's often something hard to debug. And I almost wish there was a linkage between the code that where you sit there and you write a JSP and the code that sits there and says, oh, this is what we're going to pass to you. So.
Okay, so all abstractions come with a cost. You can do what you are suggesting definitely very easily with the MVC, Jakarta MVC specification, because basically what it does at the end of the day is simply manipulate and parse whatever is in the HTTP request, which is relatively easy to debug and take a look at. JSF, on the other hand, is a matter of abstracting the UI layer as much as possible to get productivity. So I would not expect that to change for anyone really to be able to introspect how JSF is actually manipulating the request. I think that's basically not JSF at all. The JSF expects that is basically an abstraction layer. If you need to debug something, just debug it on the server side and say, hey, what am I getting? Once JSF is done with this lifecycle, I would not try to simply trying to look into the JSF lifecycle itself. I don't think is what the design intent of JSF ever was.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. If we go back a while, there was a world when enterprises used one of the three big application servers when they deploy Java EE applications internally. That's WebSphere, WebLogic, and JBoss. I think at one time those were the top three application servers, and I think since Java EE was divorced from Oracle, things might have changed a little bit, but I did not follow that segment of the market. I think most people went ahead and did the Spring framework, Spring Boot thing. What is the current market layout for Jakarta EE?
Okay, so there's a couple of different takes of this. Numerically speaking, if you look at the Jakarta EE developer survey that I've linked, basically that is if you will, again, probably a Jakarta flavored way of looking at the world. So that data basically says 60% using Tomcat, and that includes most likely Spring Boot users. And that maps all very cleanly to the fact that in the survey, 60% is saying I'm using Spring. The second, and so the other respective options, literally in order, are Wildfly, and then I think that is at almost 30%. So very much the leading Java EE server these days. I believe third place was Jetty. Fourth place was JBoss EAP with I think about 15%. And fifth place, surprisingly, was Quarkus with almost, I believe, 10% of the market share amongst Java EE developers. The rest of the app servers were under the 5% threshold. right? So this would be WebSphere, WebLogic, OpenLiberty, Payara, and the like. Now, in my observations with the Java EE customers that I work with, that is reality. I think definitely WebLogic and WebSphere Traditional are very much legacy products, right? The only people that are using these are people that have deployed it and have been using it probably for a good portion of 10, 15 years.
Okay. Thank you.
New applications in general are either using those more popular choices in my observation. Now, one of the things I will mention is I'm always disappointed that OpenLiberty and WebSphere Liberty is not more popular. In my opinion, it really strikes a very good balance in terms of what a compatible implementation without getting into things like Graal and so on would look like if it was modular and lightweight, but still provides compatibility. So in other words, it does not compromise on what it is giving you at the end of the day, even if it provides it in a modular way. So
it does provide it in a modular way, but here where it misses the mark, it's a different standard and it's very hard to adopt. If you've been doing JEE for, let's say, 10 years, 20 years, okay? It's a totally different profile, and therefore you're composing the needed ideas of the same way that you think of like Maven, but it's a different server.xml inside of that profile. And therefore it's compatible that you could use that server.xml and deliver it to a full JEE server like WebSphere, and therefore it would understand it. But most of the time, you're trying to create a composable item that is not easily understood. So what's happening is people are moving away from this because it's not the common thing. And therefore, Spring is more in the future for where everybody's looking at it right now. But now Spring is not being favored as much because of its latency and its memory issues. If you find a 6 terabyte Spring Boot running, you have problems. And how are you going to fix that? And therefore, that's why Quarkus, yes, you have to change the classes. Yes, you have to change the way you use the same RESTful things inside of the servers and talk to a database, and you have to change the classes. Okay, it's not, but when you start first with using Quarkus, it's better. It's a good core.
So again, interestingly, though, in favor of OpenLiberty, I have seen folks actually a few instances where folks have moved from things like, certainly from WebSphere Traditional, lots of folks, that's a natural transition point for them to move to Liberty. I have even seen folks move from things like Wildfly and JBoss EAP because they're not as modular. Right, so they do provide the application server model, so you do get the compatibility, but they're not as modular. And in general, they only say good things, about the way Liberty does the balance between still, providing you full compatibility, Jakarta EE microprofile, and being able to slim down to a reasonable footprint. Right, to what you need. So I think OpenLiberty, if I were to say this, this is where, aside from the data, sort of my observations, I think if you're looking to stay with the, short of, again, going to Graal VM and the like, it's a good, nice underrated runtime to take a look at.
Thank you for your thoughts.
Okay, so is there anything else that I missed?
Who is working on your standards going forward with Jakarta? Who is the larger audience? Vendors specifically. Are they participating with you?
Yes, of course. So basically all of the vendors that have been there before are still continuing to be there. Those are the Oracle, IBM, Red Hat, Payara, folks in the community. What has happened is, in the Sun and Oracle days, effectively 80 to 90% of the development came from Sun and Oracle. And to some extent, that was deliberate, right? That was by design. That was the intent. I think what is happening now, and there's a nice actually graphic on the Jakarta EE page that shows you, who contributed what. And it looks a lot more symmetric. It looks like a bunch of people from many different companies that are Jakarta EE stakeholders and Java EE stakeholders are contributing, as opposed to a large footprint, from a single company. In fact, if you look at OpenJDK has a similar contribution graph, and you can guess how that looks like, right? That looks very much like Java EE used to. A very large disproportionate share comes from Oracle, and tiny, small, much smaller contributions come from the rest of the ecosystem, like Red Hat and IBM, and all the rest of the OpenJDK vendors. So, in my opinion, from that standpoint, it has really been a success. What is missing is what we hoped was individual contribution, at least from the Jakarta EE ambassador side. We were hoping for a lot more developers to contribute to the standard. So I think that is a gap that I'd really like to see be addressed. I think vendor-wise, things are, I think, exactly as we had expected it to be.
So what standard are you working on now? As an example, the way I used to follow this in the past was by JSR number, and the future roadmap that the vendors were coming against and saying, I'm implementing this JSR for this particular, like JTA or.
So it's no longer JSR, it's projects. So if you look at my slide deck, you will see that there is a link to all of the projects that comprise Jakarta EE. Each project, not every single project is a specification project, but majority.
So the other vendors are also following these same standards and implementing against these same standards, yes?
Correct, yes. So basically.
That's all I'm looking for.
Okay, so personally, I follow all of them. I follow every single project, basically every single mailing list that is available.
I'm not looking for the mailing list as much as it is that there is some standards that you will all implement against, and therefore there is some general governing body that says, hey, this is the new feature that we want to implement. Let's say it's Mail 3.0. Therefore we're going to all, this is the specification we're going against, and go ahead and implement what you want.
So that is worth looking at. That is not like it used to be in the JCP. So there is a governance process. There is a governance process. There's something called the platform specification project. But the platform specification project's job is not to control what individual projects are doing. So individual projects actually have their own autonomy. Ultimately, it's the project committers for a specific project that determine what actually happens. So again, this was done by intent to break the top-down way of doing things. In fact, again, I'll make a comparison with OpenJDK. OpenJDK, although it's broken down by JSRs, sadly, a lot of that roadmap actually comes from Oracle's JDK team still today, and it is very, very top-down. In Jakarta EE, it's the opposite. So everything is actually defined by the committers in each of the projects. And the only thing that the platform specification really does is just determine what winds up in the platform and what doesn't.
Okay, thank you. It helps me a lot to think about what's going forward.
Okay, anything else I missed?
All right, if there's no more questions, I guess we'll go ahead and stop the recording and we can move to the raffle here.
Just one last question.